you are by my side all along the way, as long as you are in my eye, I can see it through. As long as you
Revolutionary War History of William Wiley and Isabella Kelso, Women of the Revolutionary War. Elizabeth Fry's Ellett Volume 3 page 284. Isabella Wiley was the daughter of Samuel Kelso, who in 1780 lived on the north side of Fishing Creek Churchyard. Some vestiges of the settlement remaining at the present day. Of his children were grown at the time of the war, and took part in scenes. Isabella heard the gun fired at Mr. Strong's house a few hundred yards distant on the 11th of June, and going there saw the murdered youth, and witnessed the heart-rending anguish of his mother. Kelso's house was robbed of everything, and the swords he had been manufacturing were carried off. Had he been at home he would probably have been slain, but he and his 2 sons were in the American camp. They were engaged in most of the battles of 1780 and the following year. At Sumter's surprise young Samuel had his whiskers cut off by a bullet, and George, severely wounded, was left on the ground for dead, but crawled to a loose horse, mounted him with difficulty, and effected his escape. While Tarleton lay at White's Mills, his mother's house was plundered, and Isabella went to make complaint, but received for the stolen property nothing but curses and blows. One Tory said to her sarcastically, "So, you rebels have killed all the redcoats down at Fishing Creek," a taunt that made his presence intolerable to her even long after the war. When inquiries were made of women who had been at Camden, concerning the prisoners there, it required no great penetration to discover that the fair Isabella took a special interest in one among them, for the name of William Wiley was never uttered without a blush like the rose. This soldier, a few weeks after he obtained his liberty, was united to the beautiful maiden by the Reverend Mr. Simpson. He was the eldest son of Peter Wiley, the poet of the day, who has left a volume of unpublished verses. His home was at the Big Spring, 6 miles north of Chesterville. William was in military service from the commencement of hostilities, fought under General Williamson, and was with Moultrie on the retreat from Black Swamp to Charleston, was in McClure's company under Colonel Washington at the surprise at Monk's Corner, and did his part bravely in the succeeding battles. While the Whigs were at Clem's Branch, he and a comrade obtained leave to visit their homes. As they lay by on their way, Wiley fast asleep on the ground while his companion was washing his shirt in the stream, he was awakened by a kick, and looking up saw a British dragoon standing over him with his sword drawn. The 2 prisoners were taken to Rocky Mount, whence Wiley made his escape on the morning of July 12th. He met on the road the redcoats flying from the battle at Williamson's, and shortly after his gallant captain, McClure, scouring the country in pursuit. He joined him, and was with him on his last field. Being on separate duty he was not at the surprise of August 18th, but in December was sent by Colonel Lacey, who had formed a camp on Turkey Creek in York District, to Morgan's camp, then at his father's house. He was accompanied by the brave, hopping John Miller, and on Sandy River fell in with a large Tory party under the command of one Nichols. Both took to flight, but were closely pursued, and when Wiley's horse began to fag, Miller, seeing that the enemy gained on them, proposed to turn and fight. Wiley, however, saw that they were too many, and insisted on Miller's saving himself. He then dismounted and leaped over a fence, hoping to make his escape, but Nichols cleared it on horseback after him. Wiley posted himself at a tree, determined to sell his life dearly, and was about to fire on Nichols when he called to him that he should have quarter. He then threw down his gun, but would have been killed by the other Tories when they came up, had not their leader thrown himself between them. They took his jaded horse, flung away the saddle, and mounted him, tying his legs and arms, and went on. The first place at which they stopped was the house of William White, a thorough Whig, whose wife Jane had the spirit of a revolutionary matron. In her broad Scotch dialect, she asked, Willie, lad, have ye had anything to eat the day?" And when told he had not, and was very hungry, "Then ye maun tak a bit of bread, and a wee sup o' buttermilk," she said, "till keep up your strength, for by the company ye are in ye have a long ride afore ye." "No," exclaimed one of the loyalists, "I'll be damned if he does, we'll hang him." On hearing this Mrs. White turned round, and poured out such eloquent denunciations against all Tories and redcoats, that the men were glad to make haste and be out of the reach of her tongue. At night they stopped at the dwelling of a poor family, where little was found in the way of provision. Wiley was put into a back shed, where late at night he was visited by Nichols, who crept in on his hands and knees, to give his prisoner a piece of bread and encourage him by kind words. He had not absolute control over his gang, but promised better treatment when they arrived at Winnsboro. This attention Wiley long remembered, and on hearing afterwards that Nichols had been taken and hung by the Liberty men, said he would have ventured his life to save him. Early the next morning they reached Winnsboro, and Wiley was taken to the quarters of Lord Cornwallis, where Tarleton was at the time. His lordship asked him many questions about the rebel army, and ordered some liquor to be given him. The prisoner drank sparingly, for he suspected the motives of such an indulgence, and was determined to give no information that could injure his friends. Cornwallis and Tarleton were walking the room, and frequently spoke together in a low tone while conducting the examination. The Tory Colonel Phillips was standing by, and at length beckoned to Wiley, whom he well knew having lived near his father in Ireland. When the prisoner went to him, he said in a persuasive manner, "William, gang home, bring in Frank and Jemmy, unquit the rebels, or ye will be caught and hung, as ye can they did McClurky of Rocky Creek." The advice, it need not be said, was lost upon Wiley. On the day that Tarleton marched from Winnsboro to attack Morgan, he was sent with a guard to Camden, where he lay the greater part of the winter in jail, being liberated at the same time with McCalla. After his marriage, Wiley enlisted in the state troops with Captain John Mills, in the regiment under Colonel Henry Hampton, where he served as sergeant to the end of the war. He was a man of great bodily strength and an invincible spirit, withal something of a poet, and possessed of a fund of wit and humor. These qualities made him the delight of the soldiers, and his shrewd and piquant sayings were long afterwards treasured up by his acquaintances as well worth repeating. During his absence in camp, Mrs. Wiley lived with her father and father-in-law, and after his return they remained for many years at the Big Spring. In 1820 they removed to Perry County, Alabama. Most of their children went to the West, and there are remaining only Mrs. Walker and Peter Wiley of Chester District. The father died in 1830. It was in the quiet domestic circle that Mrs. Wiley so well performed her part, exercising through her unobtrusive and unappreciated labors an influence that has not yet ceased to be felt. By the diffusion of the principles in which her youth was trained, she wrought incalculable good. When after the war was ended, some Southern churches suffered the infliction of ministers destitute of vital religion, and men of the Revolution were led astray, Mrs. Wiley, with other women of the neighborhood, exhibited an unwavering spirit in rebuking infidelity, setting a bright example of firm faith and devotion to the precepts of the Bible. Her constant reading of the Scriptures, and religious conversation, were never forgotten by those who had the advantage of her training, and the good effect of such lessons has been proved by the patriotism and usefulness of her descendants.
Senhor.